Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you here, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. I have the pleasure of inviting our guests. Just going to introduce them in turn to join me on stage. Mr. Esteran is Chief Sustainability Officer for City Developments Limited, and she's just coming in. Mr. Lo Wan Chun is Vice President of SIAS, and also in his day job, the CEO of Black Sun Asia Pacific. Dr. Na Pham is a Senior Research Fellow with Monash Center for Financial Studies, and she's also co-chair of the Financial Capital Committee for ICGN. And last but not least, Mr. Tay Woon Teck is Managing Director for Business Consulting and Head of Private Client Services at RSM Singapore. And of course, Amar is joining us from Hong Kong, and please, Amar, of course, I think you might be able to see us, but do jump in as and when you have a point of view. And of course, joining in the conversation here with our guests will be all of you seated here at the Suntec Convention Center, and also all of you who are watching us from wherever you are, whether it's at home or in the office. So I encourage you to join in the conversation as well. We have about an hour for this panel discussion, and I'm going to get some views around the floor here together with Amar in Hong Kong, and we encourage you to be part of it as well. As Mark has been talking about, you've got access to the Pigeonhole facility. I encourage you to type your questions in there, and I'll try to facilitate as many of those as we can in the time that we have. All right, so that's how we're going to be running the next hour or so in this session. So maybe just jump into the conversation with my guests here in Suntec. We're going to talk about two things. One is how are investors driving the ESG agenda? That's the first part. And secondly, more important, with all the directors who are in our midst today, what do boards actually do in this equation? So maybe just jump in. Amar has spent a little bit of time over the last half an hour or so to give us his take, setting the stage, setting the scene for this topic, which is extremely important in terms of ESG and stakeholder capitalism. So just go to the panel for the moment. In terms of a key takeaway from Amar's presentation, what is the one thing that stood out for you? And as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a very diverse panel in terms of gender and also in terms of experiences. So we'll start with the lady first. Esther, you go.
Good morning, and thank you for having me, and thank you for reminding us all the important key points, Amar. So as a listed company, and we have, in the business for almost 60 years now, and what we are proud of is actually since 1995, we have already looking into how we could, transform our business model to one that, conserve as we construct. And of course, 20 over years ago, we did not know that today, ESG has really exploded into the mainstream, whether it is the political, business, and NGO agenda. So now what we are looking at, there's an emergency there, that we have to look at, the climate emergency. And I still remember that, when I was actually have the honors to attend COP26 last year, everywhere you turn is race to zero. And in fact, this is a very powerful North Star goal that connects everyone, and not just, of course, country, and many countries now have already set, net zero target, and it also set target for, businesses. And then most importantly is, if you look at net zero, it's what connects the, the dot of the financial market. And of course, the institutional investor, the asset owner, was formed in 2019. Before Glasgow, and then the insurance firm also formed the Net Zero Alliance in July 2021. And in November at Glasgow, we saw the Banking Alliance, and of course the GFANZ, the Glasgow Alliance, bringing together the stock exchanges of the world, the businesses, and all that. And today it represents 90% of GDP in the world. So they are going to, really shift and all that. And of course, very importantly, investors. As listed company, we need to, tap onto the fast-growing ESG funds. And in today's, emergency, we cannot play defense anymore. Corporate governance, risk management is fundamental. But how do you turn ESG into business value and into long-term sustainability, and make sure that it can actually help to serve as like business advantage that would differentiate, a company. And well, that is something that I can elaborate a little bit more.
So very interesting. That's a listed company point of view. I'm going to bring Wan Chun into the equation because you represent the retail investors, right? So big company, obviously listed companies, they are a stakeholder in this entire game. From a retail investor point of view, when you listen to Amar, what stands up for you?
Well, Amal ended his session with lots of questions. And I believe that that's the starting point for retail investors to understand what questions to ask. ESG is in a transitional stage right now. And the questions that are asked are difficult questions. It's like asking, how long is a piece of string? The answer is, the piece of string is twice as long as half its length. It's a logical, correct answer, but it doesn't answer the question. So I think from a retail investor's point of view, it's really enabling them to ask the right questions.
Okay, so giving them the tools to be part of this conversation. Now, come on in. I mean, from your perspective, when you look at it from ICG's point of view and also in your work in this particular area, your reaction in terms of a key takeaway point.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a very interesting. It was a very interesting presentation, and I actually have two key takeaways from there.
Okay, a bit of audio issue, but I think if you keep going on, they will adjust it.
The way that I really appreciate, and I really want to kind of encourage other investors to think about that in the same way. It's about the priorities, the engagement priorities, and BlackRock has board quality and effectiveness, and two other governance priorities, and board quality and effectiveness is actually the first one. And I quite agree with that, because I think, if you can get the right board together, if you can fix the board, if you can communicate the priorities to the board, other issues like the governance of social risk or the governance of environmental risk will just fix themselves.
Would say you have the interesting vantage point. Not only do you observe the developments in ESG and the corporate governance space, but you also advise your clients in terms of what to do, what should the boards be doing. I just want to get you into the picture in terms of when you listen to Amar talking about the stakeholders and the investors' point of view, how do they shape the agenda? What are your thoughts in terms of your takeaway and your high-level view on this?
I want to address this in two areas. One is to the board of directors. I think a lot of companies today are rushing to set their net zero targets, right? But the reality is, from the International Energy Agency report, 40% of those net zero targets can never be achieved. They don't even have a plan. And if you really drill down to the plan, we are talking about, a reduction of carbon emission by 20%. So my point, which is what Mr. David Jarrett said this morning, you've got to be very careful when you go out as a board to talk about your net zero plan, because you have to go down to the details. Today we are dealing with the how. I think the what and the why people understand, but how are you going to do that? And if you go down to the science of this, the French Carbonate 4 has already told us that, it's very difficult from a science perspective to say that as a company, you achieve net zero, and if you aggregate all the companies together, the whole world will be net zero. So we like to use acronym. So my point is, we have to get down to the specifics. Like what Changi Airport say, I'm going to cut the use of energy for air conditioning by so much. These are very tangible, and people can see that. Right? Why this is important? Because we are dealing with a intangible asset called trust. If you don't have trust, whatever you're going to do is not going to work. The second part, which is to the investor community. Actually, there is this Professor Ashok Damodaran, a very well-known professor in valuation, did a study. And the study is interesting because it says that actually for those ESG, very high in ESG, the returns are not so distinct. It doesn't mean that the stock market rewards them better or the investors reward them better. So the idea here is not about chasing after returns. The idea here is, and what he is saying is, maybe for the investor world, is for you to invest in these companies that are having high emission and force them to change their practice, because then you have a positive impact. If you shy away from them, that's worse because probably they don't need the money. But if you actually go in there and make a change, right? So it's not how many projects you turn away. It's actually engaging the board and getting them to make those necessary change. So two food for thought for the people, and online and offline.
Okay, very good food for thoughts, because I think the question is the how, and it's really a point that we should try to address in this panel discussion. So Amal, come on in on this one, okay? Because I think at the end of the day, we're trying to get companies to look at ESG and also climate change as from a financial as well as economics lens. It's not just about, just a short-term thing, it's a rather long-term thing. So my question to the panel is really, how do you get the companies to do this? How do you get them to drive what you believe are the critical aspects or the key principles on driving this ESG agenda? When you think about the how should they start to think about this conversation? Maybe Amal, come in first, since you're watching us and we're seeing you on the screen, and we just want to ensure that you're not left out in this conversation.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I agree very much with the last panelist. BlackRock as a house is not taking a divestment approach to ESG, apart from coal sector. And even for coal sector, it's only in our active portfolios, which is a small part of our overall portfolio exposure in the markets. But apart from coal sector, for oil and gas, for energy, for building materials, cement, steel, etc., we are engaging with companies. We are not divesting from companies. And we believe that the journey to green is through various shades of brown. And so we are trying to engage with the companies to see how they get to lighter shades of brown and eventually green, hopefully, in the longer term. So divestment is not the approach that we emphasize. But in terms of performance and the incentives for the companies, as I mentioned earlier, I look at governance generally and ESG more as well as more the sort of checks and balances. And to look at, if you look at how good the suspension of a car is or how good the braking system is, and you measure it by how fast the car can go, you're measuring it the wrong way. And similarly, to look at what is good governance or good ESG by how well the stocks do, you're measuring it the wrong way. The stocks that perform very strongly are based on the fashion in the market at a particular time and what's happening in the world and in the markets over the last 6 or 12 months. What we've seen over the last 6 and 12 months is Russia invasion of Ukraine and coal prices, gas prices globally going up. And in that sort of environment where commodity prices are going up, then the so-called dirty stocks will outperform. So whether high ESG outperforms or underperforms depends on a lot of factors, including your starting point of measuring the performance and your ending point, your more recent point of looking at the performance. But the important point for finance professionals and finance directors, CFOs, etc., is that there is no doubt that the cost of capital will come down for companies that are taking ESG seriously. The banks are offering discounts on green loans. Bonds that are for sustainability projects have a bigger range of potential investors, and because of that, the yields are slightly lower. I think over time, the yields and coupons on green bonds, the discount will widen bringing the cost of capital even lower. And so for the finance people and corporates generally, the big incentive here is cost of capital rather than what stocks are doing on a 6 to 12 month view.
Okay, that's an interesting point of view. I'm going to bring Esther in because I think you look at it, you probably have a challenge in your company, right? When you start talking about ESG from your neck of the woods as Chief Sustainability Officer, you have to talk to your finance, you have to talk to the rest of the stakeholders within the organization. So on this point about, looking at it from the financial and economics lens, how do you do it in your firm, in your company? Maybe share with us some examples or how you have conversations like that.
I think fundamentally, the word integration is very important because ESG cannot, work in silos. So I'm very fortunate that, since day one, I only report to the CEO. And since 2012, we set up a specific committee, board committee level, comprising 3 independent director and the group CEO, providing advisory as well as operational support. And that was called 2012. We called it CSR and CG board committee. And I assumed the title of Chief Sustainability Officer in 2014. So what we look at is actually vertically, you integrate it into the business strategy and also every level of your company, from the board to the top management, mid-management, operations, and horizontally, I chair the sustainability committee that cut across all business units. Just now you talk about finance is one of the major ones, but we also need to look at, when you talk about net zero, who are the people who help you achieve it? It's the people who build, develop, and maintain our properties, and also stakeholder, community, IR, everyone in the company must know what exactly is the direction of the company. And then with this corporate structure, then you can really, talk to everyone, integrate everyone into this, strategy. And we are not playing an operational role. And we have actually started sustainability reporting in 2008. 15 report now, and going to preparing the 16 report. And that help us to align, bring everybody together to set strategy and target. And of course, Mr. Larry Fink's letter is a very good compass over the last few years. Where is the direction and what they are looking at? And of course, I can explain a little bit more on net zero. How do you set it so that you won't be, deemed as greenwashing?
Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. Won't come into the picture because Esther does it from a company's point of view, right? You talk to clients when you try to advance this conversation about financial economics. How do you, talk to your clients in terms of setting the agenda for ESG?
To me, I think I tell them this is more a existential risk. Why? Because if you look at what is it today, if you don't have this longer-term view on long-term stakeholder capitalism, in the long run, you're going to suffer. And while I agree with the reality is the investor world and the provider of capital are truly looking at this. Give you one very interesting example. We are talking about this pension fund, CalPERS in California, right? 2018, they got a police surgeon that got voted in because he is saying that this pension fund is focusing a lot on ESG-related project to the extent that the returns has performed below the average returns. And as a result, the pension funds suffer, and there's not enough money for the people who retire. You touch on the S factor. There's always a trade-off. How are you going to do that, right? But to the credit of CalPERS, they stay firm on long-term capitalism, and they say, I'm going to ban on anything that invests in tobacco. Even though statistically, right, it can be proven that the returns from the pension fund will increase by how many billions, right? And there will be a lot more to give the guarantee to the pensioners. They say outright no. So I'm glad to tell you all, this guy has been voted out last year, right? But how many of our investors, those who are capital providers, can stay firm on long-term stakeholder capitalism? If we really want to change that, then we need to have a lot more examples like CalPERS Investment Committee who stay firm and say no, right? we have to recognize there's a trade-off.
Yeah. Okay, now you wanted to come in because you work a lot with institutional investors in your neck of the woods. What's your viewpoint on what we've been talking so far?
So yes, I would like to see that issue from two level. At the kind of overarching level, it is where the investors are really, it is important for investors to make companies understand how this overall ESG environment is going to affect their long-term business strategy and also their risk appetite. So this is more like at the overarching level. For example, energy companies, we all know that they really have to, especially if the energy portfolio is based mainly on coal-fired power, then they have to make a shift. And how do they make the shift? And what kind of business strategy they have around it? The second level is at the transactional level, because we all know that if we want to apply a financial or economic lens to it, at the transactional level, it is all about asset valuation, cash flows, what kind of discount rate of return you want to use, what kind of capex plan, what is the capital adequacy, for example. And I want to give two examples here the first one is about carbon pricing, right? So we know that it is important, it's coming to many companies that they have to factor in how the introduction of carbon prices in certain jurisdictions around the world is going to hit their profit and loss. And at Monash, we have a real carbon price index that actually traces the carbon price over the years. And we see that the carbon prices in different jurisdictions do vary. Some, it is priced more than $100, and then in other, it's less than $1, right? So all of those companies have to factor that in and see where the trend of the future carbon prices. The second is, for example, modern slavery. In Australia, investors are now required to have an overarching consideration of modern slavery risk in their portfolio, but they also engage with the companies so that companies can manage modern slavery risk in their own operations and in their supply chains. And at Monash, for example, I'm on the Modern Slavery Steering Committee. So we know at the transaction level, if you want to look into the supply chain and you want to choose one supplier versus other suppliers, there is cost implication. Sometimes we say, okay, if we want to choose that supplier, it is 10% more cost, but it seems that we have lower modern slavery risk. So all of those at the transactional level is also very important. And by those examples, company will see how the E and the S factors are actually very financial in that sense.
And that's an interesting point, because I'm going to bring Wan Chin into the conversation and maybe a point of view from you as well. So, Na mentioned an interesting example, which is the energy companies. So a lot of the criticisms, perhaps, maybe fairly or unfairly, level on energy companies, and whenever we talk about climate change, we talk about ESG and sustainability, right? They're probably getting the brunt of the things. I'm just interested, when you look around the block from your neck of the woods, when you want to position this conversation about the agenda for ESG, how would you position this conversation, I suppose, for all stakeholders, so that everybody gets something out of this, everybody feels that they're getting a win as opposed to a zero-sum game? Because that's one of the issues right now, that everybody thinks is a zero-sum game. If one stakeholder wins, somebody else is paying for this somewhere else. Wan Chin, maybe from a retail investor point of view, and then we'll get Amar from institutions.
It's a tough situation. Retail investors want to see what's the difference. Whether it's a zero-sum game or win-win situation, retail investors want to see, does ESG, has it made that difference? And that's where the word difference come into play. How do you measure that difference? So things which are immeasurable, I think, makes it very difficult. With the E, you talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. In some ways, it can be measured. But you talk about the S, for example, like today is World Mental Health Day. How do you measure mental health? And this is where retail investors struggle. And coming back to the same questions, how long is a piece of string? So my advice is really to start upon an education program to help retail investors ask those right questions, and then by that expecting the right answers.
All right. Amar, come on this, because I think in your presentation earlier, I heard you say, BlackRock has, of course, been talking to many companies, and you have actually exercised your right to vote, and you voted down some ESG initiatives that don't fit your bill, as it were. When you look at this whole idea of talking to the companies that you invest in, your clients, how do you position this conversation?
Well, I think asking the right questions is actually very important. It's the starting point. And what you ask about, the global frameworks on sustainability reporting, TCFD, ISSB is coming out, reporting by those metrics gives you more tangible, granular data to compare how one company is performing against its peers within the region and globally. But when it comes specifically to energy companies, like a lot of other sectors, even the energy companies, there are opportunities as much as there are risks. And the opportunities is renewable energy. You have a number of these big energy, oil and gas companies going into hydrogen, exploring and doing R&D on hydrogen, and of course also going into solar. And I think much more on solar compared to wind. So we don't tell the companies, you have to do this or that or the other. As investors with a huge number of companies that we have exposure to, we're not experts on whether hydrogen is the way forward or whether carbon capture has the economics coming, to be a meaningful reduction in emissions over the next 5 or 10 years. But we ask the questions of the companies. If your government's target is 2050 or 2060, what do you need to do to meet those targets long term as well as medium term? And then over the next 5 or 10 years, what are your capex decisions? And how much of your capital expenditure is towards renewable energy or cleaner processes? And how do you determine what is sensible expenditure on renewable energy and carbon reduction? Are you looking at IRRs yet? Or is it still more R&D, which is expenditure that needs to be done to develop the technologies? So we ask these questions of the companies so that we get a better idea of where the companies are coming from and whether the companies are taking these issues seriously. And then when it comes to our voting, essentially, if the companies are not coming up with anything sensible, in our view, and if they are not providing the reporting that we think they should be providing, and starting off with TCFD, then we vote against directors for re-election. So that's a summary of our approach on this.
Okay, your approach is very interesting because that triggered a little bit of reaction you might be able to see or not from Esther, because as you were talking about that, she was sort of gesticulating to me to say that she's got something to say on that.
Yes, thank you, definitely. I mean, data is king. Because in order to help investors and financiers to make that $1 million decision, you have to present data. They're not here to drink coffee with you. When they come to see you, they really want data strategy. And I like TCFD, which I totally align with what Amar has shared, that climate risk is definitely business and investment risk. We are a listed company. We want to attract funds, but we are also an investor company as well. So how do we make that decision is very important. And we look at data is the really providing the compass for us. And as a listed company, and global studies show that there are actually about 600 ESG ratings and ranking and standards and framework. So how do we, as corporate reporter, to choose a framework and to formulate a framework that is material to us is very important. And also align with investor, because it's not the more the merrier. So what we do is every year we have a materiality study asking internal and external stakeholders what are the most material issues. I can't report 50 ESG issues. It will become a phone book. So we just look at the top 15 and we look at what are the most material. And when you say you embrace, certain, targets and all that, how does it relate to your material issues and also TCFD, the 4 pillar? What I like most is actually not the others are basic, fundamental, corporate governance, risk management, matrix, and target. The most important thing is strategy. Okay, so that actually helped the company to embrace everything, make sense of your strategy, your targets and goals, and how do you have a pathway or a roadmap to achieve such goals. Setting goals is just the beginning. How do you measure it, and manage it, and also disclose it promptly and openly, and through your sustainability reporting, ESG ratings and rankings, which are independent assessment, and those are important because a lot of investors, financiers are looking to that to make that decision, whether it's ESG fund investment, ETF, or even sustainable finance and green bond. And that was how we really learned the way that financiers really look at your corporate track record on ESG when I rolled out the first green bond by a Singapore company in 2016. So data is king. Yeah, we are.
Okay, now.
Yeah.
I would like to be very brief, but I would like to share the experience from being a consultant for IFC. I think it's, especially coming back to your questions of how to actually get a win-win result for both investors and companies. I guess that the pressure is from at all the different levels of the market. Investors and asset owners have their own targets, and then they push that pressure down to asset managers, and then down to company level. So I guess it's important to be very inclusive about the why, because you want to consider the interests of various stakeholders. So you have to be very inclusive in terms of understanding why companies should do this or recommending a certain strategy for the company. And the second point, I think, is to be very realistic about the what. And number 3 is about to be very supportive about the how, because companies need to be supportive along the way.
Okay, Woon Taek?
I think one key factor that we have to look at is education. I think data is important. I already noted that SGX and MAS already set up an ES genome, right, to codify and to make sure that there is a structure, right? The why part we all understand. But I still come back to the how. And education is important because when you look at scope 3, greenhouse gas emission, is it the same as carbon? It's not, right? I think there's a lot of science in this. And then the other part about education is you're changing habits. For example, as an accounting advisory firm, what we are doing, is changing habits, getting people to switch off light, getting people, right, to use less aircon, getting people to walk more than driving their own car, right? Getting people to reduce waste, particularly paper waste, right? Electrical waste, right? And educating people that it doesn't mean that when the whole population go to EV cars, we are actually green. Why? Because if you really want to ask the right question, then I will ask the car manufacturers, what is the recycling program you're going to do with all these expired batteries, right? And another question to the investor, assuming tomorrow if Apple tell you next year iPhone 15, we are going to cut production by 50%. We're not going to sell new iPhone. We're going to reinvest the money to recondition all the existing iPhone, right? Green. Will the top investors like BlackRock ditch Apple shares, or will they continue to support Apple? I think these are real trade-off issues that we need to actually recognize them and find a balance. Education is important, right?
And also getting everybody else on board, which is one of the questions I was going to ask. How do you get everybody to be on the same page? Because you rightly pointed out, sometimes a particular issue is seen as a short-term thing, and we're all aware if you're a listed company, perhaps that will reflect in your short-term share price. But if you're talking about ESG as a longer-term initiative, so something about longer-term value, where do you find a balance? How do you find this particular place to be where everybody can be happy. I think that was one of the issues that we were mentioning. I have one more point that I just want to get to before we get to the questions coming from our audience, because I can see a few popping up on the screen now. I just want to ask, the panel right now, when you talk about what should boards do, the question now is really the board agenda. We're all cognizant now that ESG is very much high on a particular board's agenda, no matter where you look, right? But in terms of recalibrating the conversations to what we're talking about today and about the longer term direction of where ESG is going to be, how, in your view, should boards recalibrate what they're talking about? Anybody wants to jump in on this?
If
Esther,
I may,
you go in.
climate should be in the center of every discussion. Yeah, and in fact, nowadays boards are really quite exposed to not just corporate governance, but also climate governance. The Climate Governance Initiative led by World Economic Forum has arrived in Singapore last October. And of course, the LED on ESG training for Board of Directors has already started in May, thanks to, SGX and SID, really pushed for it. And sustainability reporting is very important agenda in Singapore that, I'm sure that some of you have read news about ACRA and SGX RegCo has set up the Sustainability Reporting Advisory Committee.
Which you chair.
Yeah, which I have the honor to chair it, but we actually bring together, very diverse view. BlackRock is on the committee also, and so as Yu Chan. And we have like academia, we have public sector, private sector, investors, corporate, all come together, and of course the Big Four as well. The idea is like how to get more registered company on board to report sustainability. What get measured, get managed. If you don't really set target and measure, you don't talk about strategic, and operational, embracement of ESG. So I think SRASC is a very important milestone to help Singapore to raise the bar and also to help Singapore to achieve the net zero target. That's what brings everyone together.
All right, Amar, do you have a point of view on this whole idea about recalibrating the board's agenda?
Well, it's obviously, as one of the other panelists was saying, education is very important. The whole board should be fluent and conversant on sustainability challenges of the company, sustainability opportunities, as well as risks. And that, as I mentioned when I was speaking earlier, is getting information not just from management, but getting information from consultants and experts on climate issues for the sector, so that the board is able to challenge management on what management proposals are, and whether management is measuring and providing reporting that is material for the company and where the sector is going. So education is important, measurement metrics and targets, and good governance essential to be on in the right direction.
Okay, Wan Chun, come on in first. What is the view of the retail investor point of view?
We want to see boards make a very targeted move towards dealing with ESG and not be led by the frameworks and the standards. There's going to be more and more coming, like TCFD, SASB, IWSB, GRI. So boards need to peel that away and once again come back to what do you really want?
The spirit of it.
The spirit of it. Like for example, boards can say we shall do no harm. So notwithstanding any of the frameworks of TCFD, for example, which front and center in front of all of us now, just say I want to do no harm. What does it take? And I think that would drive a lot of things into motion, rather than I think we are like a deer caught in the cross-eye of a headlights of a car, and then we freeze up.
Na, do you have a point of view?
Yes, I guess in terms of the, it's important for boards to actually integrate ENS or ESG into the whole, oversight responsibilities. So first, we need to make sure that board has the expertise, and it doesn't have to be the in-house expertise at the beginning, right? So it just means that they have expertise or they have access to expertise when they need, especially about ENS matters. And the second thing that I really think is important is whether the company might want to consider whether there should be a sustainability committee underneath working under the board. Some may say yes, some may say no, but if the company wants to really highlight the importance of sustainability, then having a subcommittee would be, send a very clear message. So instead of, having the sustainable topics kind of embedded into other conversations. And the board agenda and board calendar, board needs to have specific calendar time around the year to really discuss sustainability issues. It has to be specific designated sessions on that. And it's also important for the board to actually manage or oversight the engagement with the stakeholders, because a lot of the time we say that the board needs to engage with the stakeholders to understand their view, their interests. So at least it should start with having a very clear stakeholder engagement policy and the oversight of that.
All right, just before we go to Q&A, Woon Taek, a quick point.
I asked this question to friends from overseas, and they give a view. Whether you agree, doesn't matter. They say, Singapore is going to be increasing like SOP country, run by standard operating procedures. Right? Do you agree? To each his own. But what I'm trying to say is, at the board, you got to ask yourself whether performance matter or compliance matter. If you are coming purely from 100% compliance, then I think we have a problem. I think there must be a balance, compliance and performance. And in that performance, it's not about complying with what SGX, MAS want you to do. But in the performance, you really have to work on your strategy. Is your business model still relevant? Right? Sustainable, inclusive, right? And what are you trying to service? Right? Who are your stakeholders? Are they the retail investors that will sell when your stock price go by 30-40%? Or are they long-term investors? Those are very critical questions. My view is, please focus a lot more on performance. Look at sustainable growth. Look at inclusiveness, right? Look at creating a better future for everybody.
Okay, I just want to go quickly to some Q&A that's coming from our audience. Probably some of you are in the room now. Others are also online. And I'm just going to pull out one question that's quite interesting coming from Alvin Chung. And this is coming up on your screen. I think all of you can see it now. I'll try to read it. Okay, so he says, some of the issues around KPI setting seem to revolve around the board process and the board's construct. And I think, Amar, you talked about a KPI example that suggests a breakdown of communications between committees. I'm not sure what the rest of the question is. What can be done to solve this? It's not appearing on the iPad, but I think it's on the screen here. What do you think can be done to solve this? Maybe, Amar, you come in first in terms of your idea of the KPI setting and how it kind of revolves around the board at this point.
Well, yeah, I guess it comes down to the various board committees having proper discussions and interacting. Your remuneration committee, if it's going to be putting ESG criteria into the KPIs of senior management, then has to be discussing with the sustainability committee, if there's a board sustainability committee, on what are the most relevant and challenging KPIs that should be part of the compensation terms of senior executives. So better interaction between the committees is important. But I go back to the international frameworks on reporting, and I take the point from earlier that is confusing, right? You've got GRI, you've got integrated reporting, SASB, ISSB. Now BlackRock's talking about TCFD. So many. Which one to focus on? I think one takeaway, and I'm not going to give the answer to this, but I think one takeaway is that boards should be discussing with their management and with consultants which are the one or two reporting frameworks that really matter, that investors care about, that will drive investors into putting these stocks into ESG portfolios. I think that should be one of the key takeaways of directors from today's discussion. Which of the reporting frameworks should you be focusing on?
Interesting. I'm going to bring Esther in because you are probably swimming in all of these acronyms that we're struggling with as well. What do you tell your board?
Well, that's why the global agendas to set a baseline, reporting framework and standard is definitely the way forward. But again, which standards to include and all that is important. And I'm totally agree that we are not chasing for paper. But if I can give you an example, when we meet, investors, there are three things that they always ask. What is your net zero strategy? Okay, because that is a global agenda and national agenda. So science-based target, are you on it or not? Because you have to be backed by science, not just pull a number that looks good. It has to be backed by science. So in 2017, I started working on science-based, target validated greenhouse gas reduction target. Took us 8 months. And finally get it, secure validated by the scientists, and it has to be a very, very ambitious target. Otherwise, it will not drive change. So this is point number one for investors' interest. And of course, when you talk about Scope 3, it's a huge thing that include 15 categories under greenhouse gas protocol, and a huge, complex issue. Then the second thing they ask about is DEI. Investors are very interested in talking about inclusivity, diversities, and all that. And that can be backed by data. What is your represented, percentage on your board for female or, And then the third one that they ask about is supply chain management, because you can't do it alone. And especially when you talk about science-based target, you talk about Scope 3, building materials is very key. And that is why they asked about these three, very key focus. And it actually boils down to climate, which is actually investments risk and also, a business risk. And board can play a key role from the advisory and the strategic perspective, but have to work with management together to implement it. Setting target is just the beginning. Implement it and get results is key.
Okay, anyone else in the panel wants to jump in on a point of view on this? If not, I'll go to the next question.
Yeah, if I can jump in. One of the challenge when you implement things like TCFD is it comprises a lot of things. Governance, strategy, risks and opportunities, and metrics and targets. And this is where I think boards seem to think that ESG is like a 3-in-1 coffee. If you just pour in, mix, and then you get sustainability. And forming a sustainability committee at the board level is not necessarily the only thing to do. It's not a one-size-fits-all. So let's say, for example, risks and opportunities under TCFD. Does it sit under the sustainability committee, or the audit committee, or the risk committee, or the remuneration committee? So this is where I think we need to rethink completely the governance over sustainability in the organization.
Okay, now did you just say you want to come in?
Yes, so I would like to discuss 2 points. The first is about, this sustainability reporting, regulatory fragmentation, because we see that it's quite different. Each of these standards have their own focus. So GRI, for example, focus more on the impacts that the companies may have on the environmental and social factors. But SIAS, for example, focus more on the financial materiality of the issues. And also they have very clear kind of sector-based guidance. But I think one of the good things is for the US, for the UK, for the European markets, I think the TCFD is becoming the baseline. So which is at least that would be the common denominator that we would have. And the second point, I want to go back to the questions of KPI, because a lot of the time, having KPI is important for measurement, but it shouldn't be, the destination. So at Monash, for example, we have a project where we look at modern slavery disclosure quality of the 300 largest Australian companies, and then we rate and we score them, and then we engage with a lot of companies. Now, when the company started the conversations with the question of how can we get better score next year, that would be, a kind of question we don't really want to solve, because we need them to take one step back and to really understand that the journey about modern slavery is not about improving the score. Okay. It's about, improving the operations and the supply chains. so that they can deal with that risk.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. Woon-Taek, just a quick one.
A quick
before we do the
comment.
next
It's not about
question.
KPIs, I think it's about risk management. Because if the board start to look at risk management and form a view, then you understand the trade-off. Risk management is about trade-off. It's about understanding the risk and the opportunity and find a right balance for the trade-off. If you had that kind of discussion, it's better than KPI setting.
Okay, I'm conscious also that I'm trying to answer as many questions as we can based on the number of votes, right, in terms of what I'm seeing on my screen. So I'm trying to bring up the ones that have the most votes at this point, and the next one is a little bit sensitive. So not everybody's on board. So the question here is that is coming from Raj. So he's an ESG investor skeptic. Without universal ESG standards, he's consistently confused about what's on offer. So just citing an example from BlackRock, Amal, it's not targeting you, but it's just an example that's coming from the screen here. But I'm also conscious that the others will have a point of view. So where do you think, how do you think investors, the ones who are not quite on board, how do you think they can be brought on board in terms of this whole idea of ESG standards, and what do you exclude or include? Maybe, Amar, since this is a question for you first, do you want to just take it away in terms of what BlackRock does in terms of your ESG fund?
Look, I agree that it is quite confusing in terms of what companies should be doing, what asset managers and asset owners should be doing, and how investors ultimately should be getting into the picture of ESG. I mean, you've got three different aspects to ESG, and it was an interesting analogy just now by the panelists, whether this is just like 3-in-1 coffee, you put it together and hopefully it tastes nice, but sometimes it's too sweet, sometimes the coffee is not so strong, but whether the mix is the right mix. In the end, for investors, I think, and for companies, there are two aspects to ESG. One is financial materiality. How does it impact the business? Medium term and long term. And the other is what they call double materiality, not just how it impacts the company, but also how the company impacts the environment and the community, etc. And putting all of these together, the double materiality on E, on S, on G, it can lead to confusion. And that is why I think Esther's point that we need to start off with baseline reporting that we can agree is material and relevant and comparable across jurisdictions. That is the starting point. And that is where we can start off with TCFD and SASB and to come ISSB. I would emphasize those three frameworks to help in understanding the financial materiality. And if you're not concerned about how environmental and social factors are going to impact the company over the medium and long term, then you're not an investor, you're a punter, right? If you're only interested in how the share price is going to perform over the next 3 to 6 or 12 months, okay, some people do that. BlackRock is a long-term investor. Our clients are investing for retirement. We are looking at long-term value creation. And for long-term value creation, you need to take sustainability seriously. You need to take environmental and social issues seriously. You need to be measuring those criteria and those aspects. And you need baseline reporting to get management on track and to make sure that management is delivering on sustainability issues.
Okay, Woon-Taek, you have a point of view you wanted to insert.
No, I think BlackRock has done well in investing in people like Exxon, Chevron. Why? Because they are forcing a change. And if you look at Exxon board, they are forced to look at clean energy. Shell has changed the CEO, someone that is focusing on clean energy, right? So you need the investors, and I think the investor community must send a strong signal. People like BlackRock, CalPERS. We're here to stay long-term. We are looking at long-term stakeholders, capitalism, right? And we are going to make those change. So that had a very clear signal. So it's not about investing in ESG company. It's investing in those highly polluted company and force them to make the change.
Yeah,
okay.
If I can
Yep,
add
Esther,
also,
go on.
well, last week, Singapore was like, putting green transition into the limelight and also green financing and how we can channel capital to help, industry, whether at whatever level, whether they are the dirty industry or the medium or the clean industry, how do they accelerate transition? because no company can change overnight. So we need investor, we need financier to help them, to give them a push, and technologies are already available to make a building net zero. But is it a business case? What exactly is the payoff, the payback, and also the ROI? As a business, you also have to look at long-term, the financial viability, and how do you maintain profitable to support employment and your supply chain, not at the expense of the planet and people. So this is the key things that actually investors and financiers can help channel funds to support the green transition. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to take another question just very quickly in the interest of time. This one is getting a lot of votes as well. So the question reads, the ESG conversation is pretty much moving in a single direction. How do we create room for different voices so that we can move towards longer term goals but not neglect the short to mid-term ones? It's kind of a question I raised earlier. How do you find a balance between the short-term goals of what investors want to see of their ROI, as you say, versus what they should be doing, the right thing for the longer term good of their company, their clients, their customers, and perhaps even the planet? Any point of view from the panel? Anyone wants to jump in?
Well,
If I can
sorry, I have
quickly-
to come in now.
Hold on,
Yeah.
since you're
Okay.
talking first, I'll get Na
cool.
for a second, if you don't mind,
Okay.
Esther. Na, come in first.
Yeah.
So I think this is quite an interesting question, and I really want to go back to the points that I made earlier about, if you want to support the companies, you really need to be very realistic about the what and very supportive about the how. And I guess one of the major concerns of investors is about the short-term volatility of the stock markets, right, and how share price reacts. And that is kind of a short-term or medium-term struggles. So if the company have a long-term plan, and then that is broken down into, very phases where the companies can actually release the information about the progress to the market, and that can drive positive information to the market, and that could help with that short-term struggle, because information will lead to positive share price reactions. And the second point is about supportive of the companies, whether there's education for the companies, whether that is bringing more expertise when the company needs. So those would also help with the short-term struggles that they might have.
Okay, anyone else wants to jump in on this idea about creating different voices, creating room for different voices? Esther first. I
Okay.
think Wan Chen wants to
Listed
say
companies are required to come up with an annual sustainability report. So that is actually short-term enough for you to set the interim target. You can't just say that by 2030, this is my target, 2050 is net zero, and I will tell you only by 2050. Investor will not let you go, regulator will not let you go, because listed companies are required to come up with their interim goals and targets, and performance annually. And in fact, we have actually make it even quarterly. It's online for us, the key ESG goals. And so I think setting goals is not difficult. It's like, how do you have a plan, and how do you really track it and look at whether, use the traffic lights to look at whether you're on track or off track. And if you're off track, what are the, rectifications? I think that is what, close the loop. Yeah.
Wan Chen?
Oh, here's a shout out to internal auditors. There's a great opportunity. The listing rules mandates that Singapore companies conduct an internal assurance over sustainability reporting processes. So this is where I think we have an opportunity for an independent party to look at that sustainability reporting is going in the right direction, not in one direction or two directions, but in the right direction for the organization. And this is where the board can hear from an independent voice as well as the right way to move. And we are probably the only country in the world that has this mandate in place.
Woon Taek, you
I see this as a very interesting opportunity for many listed companies. Take SIA, for example. Actually, there's a concurrence on long-term goal and short-term goal, right? If you're using more fuel-efficient aeroplanes, right, and you have a fleet renewal to basically bring down the fuel by X%, right? That's long-term. In the short-term, what you're trying to tell people is, all right, I'm replacing this. I can actually help you cut down long-term carbon emission. to better connectivity, right? Because better connectivity means I fly less. Okay? And then 3, okay, creating a sustainable operation, right? How do I? It's not about getting people to fly less. It's about getting people to plan their route better so that they don't have to take the airplane a lot more, right? So is there actually a conflict between short-term and long-term? Actually, I don't think so. It's about changing habits, right? It's about changing habits. And it's about planning your itinerary such that, okay, you fly less, do more Zoom, right? And doesn't mean that SIA doesn't meet its profit targets, no? It does. Because you're encouraging people who need to fly, please choose SIA because they have greener plane. Is there a conflict? No.
Okay. I'm just going to move on to another question now and just bringing that up. Got more votes on this one. So this is about, well, the drive towards net zero. Would the panelists agree that the FIs, financial institutions, through green financing could be an effective agent in the drive towards net zero? If your answer is yes, what can the FIs collectively do to foster this movement? Any panelists will want to come in on this one?
Can I contribute here?
Amar, go on.
Yeah. Look, I think it's about incentives. Incentives are really important for financial institutions and the corporates to be moving at a faster pace. And I mentioned earlier that sustainable loans are already at a somewhat discount to non-sustainable loans, but the discount is still very minor, a few bips. And if it's more than 20 bips on a loan, that would be, that would be exception rather than the rule. The rule right now is sustainable loans, sustainable bonds, about 20 bips or less in terms of the savings compared to non-sustainable loans. Now, what can the financial sector do to push this along faster is if you have sustainable loans, sustainable bonds getting bigger demand and therefore having a lower coupon and a bigger discount for the sustainable bonds. For sustainable bonds of the banks, the big banks in Singapore and in the region, if they are able to issue green bonds to be able to finance their green loans, and their green bonds get a bigger discount on the yield and the coupon, then they'll be able to offer the loans to their corporates at also a bigger discount. And to get that bigger discount on the bonds for the banks and for companies that are issuing green bonds, you basically need more funding from the asset owners. The sovereign funds, the multinational funds, etc., to put more capital into sustainable bond funds, into sustainable equity funds and other asset management, other multi-asset funds. When you have more capital, then the pricing, the discount, the coupon on these bonds comes down, and then you get the incentives flowing into the industrial sectors as well.
I think, Wen Tze, you're looking at me. You want to jump into this conversation with the
No, I think the FI alone is not enough. You need PPP, public-private partnership, because a lot of this requires a change in infrastructure and also a change in mindset. And the incentive must not be just the cost of capital. You need the government tax system to come in, all right? If you don't follow, you don't change enough, right? We'll slap you with carbon tax. I think those are a lot more integrated, holistic approach to force a change in habits, right? And actually, everybody has to be part of this to win over and to create a green environment.
Okay, so I think you
If
want
I
to
can just give one example, okay? Yep. I mean, definitely the data show that, there are $9.2 trillion investment opportunity per year to help the world to transit to net zero. If, we launched our first green bond in 2017, and then continuously we use different form of sustainability, linked loan, green loan, and all that. I just want to look at one example is a collaboration like what Wen say, that we partner with our bankers to come up with a framework together. We call it the SDG Innovation Loan in 2019. So basically it's to channel funds to drive innovation. So we have a very robust framework. If we can tick all the boxes that come up with an innovation that can be scaled up and also achieve results that endorsed by a third party, so we will enjoy better discount, which after 2 years since we launched, we achieved it. And then now the banks is offering our phase 2 because the loan, 250 mil, expiring just this week. So they are launching the second phase for us to continue to drive innovation together using this loan. Yeah, so I think we can collaborate, we can be innovative, and we can see results. Yeah.
Anybody else wants to jump in on this? No?
Just a very quick comment. I think as capital providers, financial institutions, the area where they can collaborate is, in terms of developing the whole ecosystem around green financing. It's not just a single, it's not just investors. So it's about industry, setting industry standards and expectations of what is green, right? That is also very important.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes to the clock, and I'm just going to fire up another question coming from someone who hasn't left their name, but this is an interesting question. Consumers and companies have to choose between the more expensive alternatives or cut back in terms of consumption to fight the increasing emissions. Do you think capital markets are willing to let go of growth in the spirit of having companies become more sustainable? I guess that's the paraphrase to this question. Anyone in the panel would like to offer a point of view? No.
I guess there are different pockets of the markets, and here you might see cuts in a certain segment of the market, but you do really see there's a lot more projects and capital expenditures in other segments. Even within the company, any single companies themselves, you have cut areas, but you also have growth area. Growth area will be into energy financing or new type of energy or new technology. So there will be ample growth opportunity as well.
Amar, maybe you come in on this one as well, because certainly this whole idea about the capital markets and the focus on growth is something that features in your calculations, even as you talk about long-term sustainable value.
Well, I'd start off by saying that there does not have to be a sacrifice on growth. If you take EVs in the auto sector, for instance, in Hong Kong, I think easily 20 to 30% of new car sales are now electric EVs, right? And the buyers of these cars are not driving less. In fact, I'm hearing people saying, because it hardly costs anything now to drive a car, I'm driving more. So actually, the volume of activity does not have to come down when you have a technology that is available. So I think the important aspect is that there must be R&D to create the technologies so that it is economical and efficient. And then, the incentives are really important so that you change the consumer behavior towards the cleaner technologies. And when you do that, it does not have to be a sacrifice on growth. And, there is huge opportunities in transitioning to lower carbon processes, systems, and economies. And that transition opportunities gives huge opportunities to corporates and to investors.
Come on in.
I'd like to be totally brutal and honest. Take the Apple example. If I buy the Apple shares, it's for fun. When the market capitalization of Apple is 2 trillion, tomorrow Apple say, okay, next year iPhone 15 cut production 15%. We're going to reinvest in refurbishing all your iPhone. No need to buy, right? I go in at 2 trillion. It's going to force a drop to 1.5 trillion. You think I will be very pleased about this because of ESG? Answer is no. So we've got to recognize there is pain in this whole process. Capital market will have to adjust. There will be people who will have to go through that pain, okay, to pursue sustainable growth, right? The reality is, can we continue to have more iPhones, more Samsung phones? And if all of us collectively agree that we have to make a trade-off, ultimately, capital market has to go through a certain level of adjustment. There will be some winners, there will be some losers. That's life.
Okay, anyone else wants to offer a point of view? If not, I'm just going to move on to one last question that we have time for. No? Okay, then I'm just going to go to the next one, which is probably more Esther first. and then for everybody else. This is the whole idea about internal audit, right? Question is, does internal audit or any external party have any part to play in validating, well, in your case, Esther, your green credentials for CDL, and also any other comments from other panelists? Esther, you go first.
Yes, for sustainability reporting, it is very essential to have the very robust external assurance, if you ask me as a practitioner. We started reporting since 2008, and from 2009 onwards, every year we have an annual external assurance for our sustainability report. Very robust and getting more and more. And we also reviewed the materiality study since 2014. And every year we spend about 3 months on the audit, internal and external audit, and engaging all the users and the business functions as well. So I think it is important because investor will look at your report and see whether the data, the information are credible, are validated. So I think it is an important steps to make your reporting, more robust and more convincing. Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts around the panel?
Yeah, if I can chime in, Melvin, if you look at the internal audit requirement from the SGX listing rules, it specifically talks about the sustainability reporting process. So it's not the output that is being audited, but really the process. And I think that's important because it gives the board the peace of mind that things are working, that whatever comes up from the process is reliable and can be depended upon to make key decisions.
Okay, any other thoughts? If not, in the interest of time, given that we've got about 3 minutes left at the clock, I'm going to ask you for one brief takeaway that you'd like to leave our audience today, both physically here as well as online. If I were to ask you one key takeaway in terms of how you would advise our investors, our boards, on this whole idea about ESG and sustainability, what will that be? Maybe Amar, given that you're online, I'm going to start with you first. One key takeaway, very briefly.
So the key takeaway is that boards have an important role in oversight of management and setting of policy. And to play that role effectively, the boards need to be open for information from consultants so that they and go through an education process so that they are able to ask the right questions. And boards need to be challenging the company and management that they're heading in the right direction, that they know what the challenges and the opportunities are, and that this is all integrated into core business strategy.
Okay, given the institutions there, now maybe you carry on that point.
Yeah, I think the key message that I really want to leave is that investors and companies are on the journey together. And in order to really both, achieve a better economy outcome, investors, I want to go back to the point that investors really need to be very inclusive about why they want companies to do certain things, and very realistic about the what needs to be done, and also to be very supportive for companies about how they could do it.
Okay, Woon Taek?
I think the world is really bipolar enough. So in this ESG discussion, don't get into a bipolar world where you have the ESG team versus the non-ESG team. I think in any of these changes, there are pains. Hypothetical example, you understand where I'm coming. There are pains. You need a dialogue. You need to find the trade-off. You need to find the adjustment such that both sides come together. Right? You are not going to win all your objective, neither the other side. But together, you forge a common consensus where real tangible results, outcomes are done to reduce carbon emission or greenhouse gases emission. I think the GHG is more important than just carbon. Right?
Okay, yeah. Esther, a brief takeaway.
Well, I think the climate will not change unless everybody change, and we need to take a holistic approach, engaging the whole ecosystem, how you produce, how you design, and I think investors definitely play a very important role. Financier, no business can grow without the financial support, insurers as well, and last but not least, just now there was a question about consumer, and in my opinion, consumers is going to be the biggest driving force.
Okay, good. Yeah. Retail, good rather segue to go to the retail investor. Wan Chen.
Well, I'll encourage you to ask the questions for which you know the answer to. Because if you ask ESG questions which you don't know the answer to, probably the answer is not going to answer your question.
Okay, on that note, I have to draw this discussion to a close. I want to thank all of you for being so participative in this, and definitely to the panelists, Amar, Woon-Taek, Na, Wan-Chen, and Esther. Thank you so much indeed for this discussion, and also for all of you for participating in this.